So when we're looking at the Gospel of John, I am quite familiar with the early church traditions, and I came across an interesting quote, actually a number of years ago, from a bishop of Ephesus. He served between, well, let's put it this way. He was born 130 AD, and he lived till 196 AD. And so he was a little bit after John, the son of Zebedee, the apostle, who died under the days of Emperor Trajan. So he would have been in touch with an understanding or a tradition of John's background. And he says this. He says, "There is also John, who rested upon the breast of the Lord, who became a priest, who wore the plate, both martyr and teacher. He sleeps in Ephesus." And so people have taken the Greek word metalon as a reference to the plate of, or to a plate of pure gold, which would be the high priest, what he was using. And so they think perhaps he might have actually entered into the Holy of Holies, maybe under a different kind of a situation with the zealots going in there, kind of a different way. Much perhaps as you served as a pastor here at Shepherd of the Valley, you weren't necessarily called, but you served. And perhaps John was there in the temple getting some experience, and we just don't have it written up because it wasn't a significant part of the priesthood back in those days. It was just kind of like a temporary functional thing. So at any rate, I wanted to hear your thoughts on the possibility of John being a priest, serving and knowing the inner workings of the temple. Can you explore that from the Gospel of John itself and what you've picked up on?
In the Gospel of John, we have at least two indicators which brings this idea into a very, very possible realm of possible interpretations. One of them is in chapter 18. We do have a scene when John, unlike Peter, who stays behind, goes into the palace of the high priest, and nobody questions him, nobody stops, nobody has any reservations, and the only reasonable explanation is he was from the family of priests and therefore had a right to be present at the probably Sanhedrin or some kind of priestly court environment. This is thing number one. And then actually he goes back and talks to the guard and says, "May my friend Peter be with me? I mean, this gentleman." And the guard said, "Sure, yeah, I mean, no problem for you, anything." And then there is another thing, in chapter 20, we see two of those guys, actually same guys, they're running to the tomb after Mary Magdalene delivered the news, and John came first, and he takes notice of that. He came first, but he stopped. He didn't go in. Peter, because he was not under the restriction for priests to touch anything that connects with death, he goes right into the tomb, and he was able to see, and then John sees that there is nothing connected with death. I mean, Jesus rose again, so then he goes in. So that gives us a very, I would say, solid chance to declare that John is from a priestly descent. Along with this, I want to quote from our, not the church father, but the LCMS church father, I would say in a sense, Paul Kranzman, who wrote a popular commentary on the Bible, and he has two parts, Old Testament and New Testament. In the New Testament, volume 1, when he gives introduction to the gospel according to St. John, he says, "There are some indications that John was well acquainted in Jerusalem and in Judea, where he had become a disciple of John the Baptist, and he was known to the high priest, and he had an intimate knowledge of the temple equipment, and the temple worship, as the entire apocalypse shows, and may therefore have been the priestly descent." So it is not a new opinion, and even though, as far as I understand, it's not the majority opinion, though I think we need to pay attention to this more and more, because if we go into the Gospel of John, into theology of John, there are a few important things that will not necessarily be contradictory to what we understood before, but will give us a new understanding. Let's put it this way. And one of them, as Kranzman says, that his familiarity with temple gives us a new additional perspective on the gospel itself. There is an important accent on the sacred calendar. And then the third thing actually is the very fact that probably because of John's priestly connections, we know some inner information that we otherwise would not have access to. For example, that after Jesus resurrected Lazarus, high priest calls for a council. And that's where he says where is this? Beginning with chapter 11, verse 45. And so the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered at the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take both our place in the nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was a high priest of this year, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." And he did not say this on his own accord, but being the high priest of the year. And he professed that Jesus would die for the nation. So unless we understand that we have access to those kind of, I don't want to say files, because I don't think it was on file, but we have access to those inner interactions between high priest and his surroundings. That's how we ended up with this information in the Gospel of John.
Yeah, very interesting. And of course, Polycrates could have been just talking in a metaphorical sense, like the priesthood of all believers, and John was a bigger priesthood of all believers guy because he was the Apostle John. But if it's taken literally, it's fascinating to think about. And that's what you've been able to explore a little bit in this conversation. So next time around, we're going to talk about perhaps how the divisions of the Gospel of John flow from an understanding of how the temple is set up. Can you give us a little sneak preview for the next time around?
The very sneak preview would be, if you look on the structure of the tabernacle or temple, any sanctuary that was established by God, the first thing you see when you enter into the sanctuary is an altar, is the altar. And then you see the somewhat laver of cleansing, so the big basin with water. So therefore, in chapter 1 of Gospel of John, we see how John the Baptist twice calls Jesus as the Lamb of God. And then surprisingly, chapter 2 is about the water. That's where we turn water into wine. Chapter 3 is about being born from water and the Spirit. Chapter 4 is where Jesus meets a Samaritan woman by the well. And in chapter 5, he helps a man to go over to be cured out of the sickness by the pool. And then when you enter into the temple, the first thing you see on the right is a table with bread. So chapter 6 begins, and I'm not going to go any further, but chapter 6 begins the whole section on the bread and the bread that comes from above.
Well, that's a pretty exciting topic. So that'll be the next time around. And actually the readings for the Sunday morning Prickly system, I think you probably use the same one. It would be the vine and the branches. So that's coming up in another Sunday. So which will be the bread of presence in the temple. We can maybe explore that theme. Sure. So for now, there was one other question I had that we're working on, and that's in the Gospel of John, that first chapter where it talks about the children of God are born in a certain way from above. And do you remember how we had a little conversation, not by the decision of a person? Do you remember that little section?
Yeah, it's chapter 1, verse 13. So those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. That's the end of verse 12. And then he begins into verse 13. He goes into verse 13, who were born not of the blood, not of the will of the flesh, not of the will of man, but of God. And it's very interesting, this will of man can be taken into a variety of ways. And one of them is, it is not the decision of humanity as a whole. The idea of to bring the Messiah at the appointed time comes from God. That's possible. What I found very interesting, actually, is if you go into modern translation, modern Hebrew translation of New Testament, the word that I expected to see there was either Adam or Ish, the one that we find in Genesis 2. Neither of them are there. The word which is there is Gaber, or the something which is related is Gibor. So having a relatively limited knowledge of modern Hebrew, I called my friends and they told me, so Gaber or Geber is the word that basically man as the one who creates the future children. So that's the thing, regardless of the fact how man try to play role in the what's the proper in the fact that the next generations come about, it's not up to the man. It's up to God.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So next time around, we'll have another discussion. Thanks so much for coming together here, and we'll try this again in another few days. God's blessings. Have a great weekend. Take care.